Donald Trump's first 100 days in office have been marked by some successes for him, admittedly, but failures in getting the passage of a few of his most high-profile and most anticipated pieces of legislation. And that has not been lost on Donald Trump, who is responding to these setbacks by questioning the fundamental checks and balances that have been a hallmark of our system of government since its founding, for the most part. We're gonna go through a few of his quotes recently because he was interviewed by Fox News, and that's where he was questioning some of these continued distributions of powers, checks and balances, and all that. In this clip, you're going to see him talking about how archaic these rules are.
I think more than anything else, I'm a person of common sense. I understand what has to be done. I get things done. I've always been a closer. We don't have a lot of closers in politics, and I understand why. It's a very rough system. It's an archaic system. You look at the rules of the Senate, even the rules of the House, but the rules of the Senate and some of the things you have to go through. It's really a bad thing for the country, in my opinion. They are archaic rules, and maybe at some point we're going to have to take those rules on. It's not fair. It forces you to make bad decisions. I mean, you're really forced into doing things that you would normally not do except for these archaic rules. So,
like what? How would you change them?
Well, you know, you look at the voting and you look at the filibuster system. I think, the filibuster concept is not a good concept to start off with. But if you're going to have filibuster, let somebody stand up for 20 hours and talk. Decisions that nobody wanted are made because of archaic rules. And that's something that I think we're going to have to change.
You mean the archaic rules that created the electoral process?
Exactly, he likes that one. The one piece I agree with him on is that I do think that if you're going to filibuster, you should stand. I think that it should go back to that traditional way. I think there's a lot of benefits that would come from that.
That's the only thing he knows about the filibuster.
That is true.
He saw Mr. Smith goes to Washington on a plane once.
Yes.
It has nothing to do with anything. He has no idea. He was saying he learned that the Senate has archaic rules, right?
He just learned about
it. I think they're arcane, but that might be a totally different thing. I do think, though, that he had no idea. We know that. He had no idea how any of this works. He didn't want to win. He didn't think he was going to win. Now he's here and he's got to criticize something. Well, it takes a long time to get something through the Senate, which is designed to be the greatest deliberative body in the world, right? I mean, that's just how it works. And it's frustrating at times. But this guy is so clueless and so inept and so unprepared for this job.
And so not, first of all, he said that he's a closer, which apparently he's not based on the first 100 days. But then also, I'm a man of
He's not an
common
opener
sense.
either, by the way.
Exactly. No, he opens by grabbing them. But anyway, look, he said there, the arcane rules force you to make decisions you never would, that you don't want to make. But what does that mean in practice? What that means, and he's talking there about the filibuster and the need to get at least some of the other party, as the distribution stands right now, onto your side. That means making decisions that aren't 100% abhorrent to half of the country.
Right.
Or honestly, more of it, because of the ridiculous arcane way that our system is set up. You can get far more than 50% of the vote in Senate races, as the Democrats did, and have less than 50% of the representation. That also is the case in the presidency. It's also the case in House races. So he seems to be benefiting and he doesn't mind too much about those sort of archaic rules that lead to them getting disproportionate influence in the legislative and executive branches of government. But he doesn't like the one that forces you to at least have a veneer of bipartisanship and get a few people to cross over. And understand his frustration with the fundamental checks and balances in our system. He's frustrated with the way it works when he has a friendly Senate and a friendly House.
Right.
Even then, he's not willing to accept what every president in American history has had to deal with.
Yeah, he's got most of the cards on the table, and he's still unable to accept trying to get a consensus on certain things. And that's what you're seeing him resistant to. This guy doesn't want to build a consensus on anything. And if you look at what he has done, and I think he's done a lot of damage in his first 100 days, it's all through executive order, it's through executive fiat, it's through the King Trump that he thought he would be.
Yes.
And now that he's running into some things that the king can't legislate by himself, he refuses to look at the consensus building as anything but archaic.
Right, and going back to archaic, well, it is archaic, but going back to archaic, he wants to be royal, right? Yeah. Nothing in America is more archaic than royalty, and that's kind of how he's wanted to govern. And it's, it's dangerous, man. And but I don't think it's so dangerous because I don't think he's able to do these. He's not going to change the rules of the Senate from the White House.
Look, McConnell talked a little bit about the possibility. He says for right now he's not interested in eliminating the filibuster for legislation, but he's already the guy that was in charge when the nuclear option was used.
Right.
There's a precedent for him eliminating the filibuster, and McConnell would like it as well.
And if Anthony Kennedy gets a cold, you're going to hear McConnell in a totally different way talking about how he would change the rules. And whether they're archaic or not, it doesn't matter. That's sort of the structure of it. I don't think archaic has to be a criticism all the time.
Well, to get back to just the way that we elect
presidents,
elect the president. I mean, that's
the best point.
That's the cornerstone of archaic and ridiculous. That is, I think many would agree, that's a bad system, the Electoral College. We talked about it before the election.
I've even defended it at times, and this election proved to me, not because of its result, but because of the way it got there to that result, that we don't need the Electoral College anymore.
Yeah. Because, but you don't see, as John says, you don't see Donald Trump taking that on, because that's what he rode to power on. He's a guy who is not interested in consensus. He's not interested in compromise. It's his way or the highway. Or as as I said before, he doesn't even know what he wants, but his henchmen and those who are a little more informed, because he's inept and completely uninformed, whatever they want, it's their way or the highway.
There's one other aspect of this. So here we have the possibly substantive power grab to shut down these checks and balances theoretically in the legislature. But it's also for Trump much more petty than that, the failures of the 100 days and what it's leading him to do. So back during the campaign, he talked about opening up libel laws. He said this. He said, one of the things I'm going to do if I win, and I hope we do, and we're certainly leading, I'm going to open up our libel laws so when they write purposefully negative and horrible and false articles, we can sue them and win lots of money. We're going to open up those libel laws so when the New York Times writes a hit piece, which is a total disgrace, or when the Washington Post, which is there for other reasons, I don't know what that means, writes a hit piece, we can sue them and win money instead of having no chance of winning because they're totally protected. So he said that back in, I believe, June of last year. I love that after all this, he's focused on the fact that he can make money out of it. He's not even saying just if they write something that's false, which is what libel laws are there for. He says if they write something that's negative, we can shut it down. Well, you might say, John, you're going crazy. That's way back in the primary. Now he's presidential Trump. Well, unfortunately not. Let's play this next video.
Change the libel laws. That would require, as I understand it, a constitutional amendment. Is he really going to pursue that? Is that something he wants to pursue?
I think it's something that we've looked at, and how that gets executed or whether that goes anywhere is a different story. I think that newspapers and news agencies need to be more responsible with how they report the news. I am so tired.
I don't think anybody would disagree with that. It's about whether or not the president should have a right to sue them.
And I already answered the question. I said this is something that is being looked at.
And so still, and this is 100 days after the inauguration, they are still looking at possibly stopping media outlets from writing anything negative or critical of the president. They have that in some countries around the world. I don't think we want to be more like those countries.
Reince Priebus is like the coach of the Browns, right? It's like, I can't believe this is my job. I can't believe that. It's like, what did I do? Spicer, yeah, but Spicer does. I think that he's a more thoughtful person than Spicer. Yeah, you may be right.
Right, but it's true. It's like if Spicer had a smarter kind of a more contemplative kind of older brother, it would be Priebus, right? And so he goes out there. What you see in Spicer is the young kid who's like just trying it out. How did that sound?
Corporate media is awesome.
Wrong.
Independent media is the way to go.
Believe me. Believe me.
Support independent media right now. Become a Young Turks member. TYTnetwork.com/join.